Today we're going to talk a little bit about measuring usage of early care and education in the NSECE data, and then also compare the usage information in the household survey to some of the enrollment information that we have from providers also in the NSECE. Okay. When we want to measure usage of early care and education in the NSECE household survey, we are primarily talking about two sets of variables that were administered to the household respondent during the household survey interview. The first of those was an enumeration of all of the non-parental care providers in the prior week, as well as any usual providers who happened not to provide care to household children in the prior week. After that enumeration is done, then the respondent walked through and described every non-parental care spell that each child had in that prior week. So, for example, we began at 12:01 the prior Monday morning, so middle of the night, and had the respondent walk us through any time the child was in the care of somebody who is not a parent to the child. Now, I said we were measuring ECE, measuring early care and education, and yet the phrase I'm using is non-parental care. As in many parts of the NSECE data, we have captured a very broad set of information so that researchers can apply their preferred definitions to the setting as they wish. In our case, we collected any time that someone other than a parent was caring for the children. Some of that is clearly what we traditionally think of as ECE, for example, time spent in Head Start or with a family daycare provider, maybe even time spent with a grandmother while your mom is at work. But it also includes any other time that you may have been with somebody other than a parent, for example, elementary school, which we typically don't describe as ECE, but also Boy Scouts, a play date with your buddy, or a karate lesson. These are all times when you're not with your parent. And so we call all of those different kinds of spells non-parental care. There are data within the data files about the nature of the relationship to the provider, who the provider is, whether or not there's any payment exchanged. And so researchers may want to apply different definitions to decide which components of the non-parental care would actually qualify for a particular EC analysis. I think generally center-based care is indeed thought of as early care and education, but whether, for example, center-based care that is in a church Sunday morning while the parents are attending a service, whether that would qualify as early care and education will depend on the research question, probably. So in terms of then narrowing the data to a definition that suits your research, here are some of the aspects that you might want to take into account. First, what types of care would you want to include? We can talk about center-based care, we can talk about home-based care, we could, and for those purposes, you're going to use the aggregate type of care variables that are available within the NSECE data, or you could construct your own. Another aspect might be what ages of children would you want to include in your analysis. The eligibility for the household survey was for any child up to the age of 13, but if your interest is in preschool, then you may not want the school-age children in your analysis. For some situations, it's common to think about childcare or early care and education as time that is spent while the parent is at work. And so a researcher could use the parental employment calendar to identify those spells of non-parental care that were happening concurrently to parental employment. So that might be another restriction that you might want to impose. And then is it paid or not may be a restriction that you want to impose. We can all think of counterexamples to all of those instances, and that's partly why we have left it very flexible. So as you're thinking about how you want to define usage, these would be some of the dimensions that you might want to consider. In terms of what the actual measures would be, the two main types of variables probably are first the numbers of providers that are reported. And so each distinct provider has a totally uninformative code number associated with that organization or individual. And that provider is then assigned both a detailed type of care, which is in a variable series called summary p-type, and then an aggregate type of care, which is a much shorter list of type of care options, and that variable series has AGG in the variable names. From the calendar, we also have hours reported in the prior week. And so one could use either hours by provider for calculations, or hours by type of care, which would, for example, combine two different individual unpaid providers into a single construct. So from these provider counts and hours counts, one could then calculate other things like you could define a primary care arrangement that might look at all of the types of care that a child is using and identify the one that takes the most hours, or perhaps if you have some taxonomy that you're interested in, so would choose center-based care first and then other formal types of care. You could similarly use the various kinds of data we have to construct rates of usage. What percent of children are using a certain type of care. In that case, some of the questions you'd want to think about would be, what's the denominator? Do you want to include all children of a certain age, only those who have any regular care arrangement, only those who have working parents, things like that. Another choice when you're calculating rates might be whether you want to do so at the child level or at the household level. The NSECE data would permit you to identify households using center-based care or children using center-based care, whichever is appropriate to your analysis. So that's what's available in the household data. But there are, of course, three other NSECE data sets: the center-based provider, the home-based provider, and the workforce. And in terms of measuring usage or enrollment, the question is really whether you would want to use the household data or perhaps the center and home-based data, which would be about their enrollment. So how do you think about which data set to use? So we can certainly learn about early care and education experiences through either the provider or the household data. Perhaps the biggest distinction is that the information that each type of respondent has is fundamentally different. What people can tell you about their child's care is different for parents and for providers. Not only is it just in theory different, I couldn't tell you what types of curriculum and what types of training the teachers have who spent time with my daughter in preschool, except in the vaguest ways, and only then because I like to do this for a living. But even aside from what in theory somebody could report, it's also the case that how much burden is involved for a respondent to report on something can also vary tremendously. A parent reporting everything their children do is likely to be much less time-consuming than a provider reporting everything that each of the children in that organization does. So how to think about whether you should approach an analysis from the provider side or from the household side. The first question obviously will be, well, are the data available that you're interested in? If you would like to do an analysis of, say, race and ethnicity of children enrolled in early care and education, do you even have the race and ethnicity data in both data files? And you do, indeed. In both the household data and the provider side data, there are variables indicating the race, ethnicity, gender, and other basic characteristics of the children participating in that level of care. The next question is probably where the nuance begins, and that would be, at what level of aggregation are those data provided? Most of the household data is provided at the individual child level. In contrast, a lot of the provider data are captured at the provider level. So we might have a variable that tells us, and in fact we do have a variable that tells us, this is the number of girls enrolled in this home-based provider's care or in this center-based provider's care. And we have another variable that says, this is the number of children with special needs. But in the provider data, what you don't know is how many of the girls have special needs and how many of the boys have special needs. And so that level of aggregation, is it enough at the provider level? Do you have it maybe at the age group level? Do you really need it at the child level? And in general, the household data are more finely disaggregated. And then the other major factor which will often determine which analysis you actually can do is what other covariates or what else do you need in your analysis, because that's where the household survey and the provider surveys probably diverge the most. Obviously, the other information available in one data file is very different from the other. And so just to summarize some of the key relative advantages of the household versus the provider data when you're thinking about doing enrollment or usage types of analyses. On the household side, you have much better child-level demographics. If you need to measure household income or poverty, that's really only available in the household data. The household also has the detailed parental work calendar, and so matching up the parental work schedule with the child schedule can provide rich information about what care is being used to support parental employment. And then finally, as I mentioned, you can use the household data either at the child level or at the household level. And so if you have a family level research question, to what extent does the distribution of ages of children affect the types of care that a family uses? That kind of work can be done in the household, but not in the provider data. Conversely, the provider data files, whether center-based or home-based, have much more information about the provider's characteristics, the size, what other age groups are served, things like that. Only the provider data really have quality or workforce-related data, the qualifications of the teachers, the types of activities, the ratios of children to teachers. And then providers are much more accurate about reporting the funding that they're receiving from such government programs as public pre-kindergarten or Head Start. And if those are your interests, then although those data are not at the child level or even sometimes at the age group level, that they are much more accurate reports about the funding streams that providers participate in and therefore the types of standards they might be subject to. Okay, that's an introduction to using household and provider data to measure enrollment and usage in the NSECE. Thank you.